Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Kenyon College's 200 Years in the Learning and Company of Friends virtual lecture series. My name is Colette Cosgrove, and I serve as the Advancement Fellow here in our alumni office. I'm delighted to kick off our fall semester with a reflection from Professor Fred Baumann on his time at Kenyon. Before we do get started, just want to go over some rules. I ask that if you feel comfortable, please put your name and your year and the year you graduated into your Zoom name. I also ask if you do not have any questions to ask, please to make sure to mute yourself just so there's no background noise happening or whatever. And then my last thing is I ask if anyone has any questions throughout his talk, please send them through the chat feature and we'll try to save most questions for the end. But don't want to waste any more time, so I'll kick things over to Fred.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. I've been teaching at Kenyon for quite a while, since 1980. That doesn't cover the 200 years, but part of it. And that is why I imagine I was asked to give this talk on this occasion. It's a great honor, for which I have both Kenyon and you to thank, but one that perhaps mere longevity does not altogether merit. Still, perhaps letting the old buffer wander around in his own fading memories may ignite those of his listeners and bring them back to a more vivid sense of their times on the Hill. And my guess is that this is why this was arranged. But when I came to Kenyon, it was already with a question, one that has stayed alive during my years here, and that is as important and ultimately unanswered today as ever. And I hope that that question will provide the spine, the organizing principle of what might otherwise be a mere and tedious symptom of my anecdotage. I got my first job at Kenyon as director of the old Public Affairs Conference Center, the forerunner of today's Center for the Study of Democracy, almost entirely without considerations of merit. My former boss at a small foundation in New York, Michael Joyce, who had moved on to direct the Olin Foundation, invited me to lunch at a hamburger joint on 44th Street to tell me that Kenyon College was asking for $100,000 over 4 years to revive the PACC. You keep whining about wanting to teach. How about I tell them we'll give them the money if they hire you, he said. I said, fine, and so did Kenyon. I'd been a historian, but this program was associated with the political science department. But it was an unusual department that emphasized the history of political thought, and the introductory course I was to teach, The Quest for Justice, was something I could handle both as an intellectual historian and because in college I'd hung out with some political philosophers. When I first got to campus, spending the night in the old Alumni house, this was for an interview, I met Joyce Klein for the first time. She was the wife of Bill Klein, a distinguished professor of English, and I hosted guests there and prepared them breakfast. It made me feel that Kenyon was somehow a personal, not a corporate place, one where people did for each other. The next day, after my interview with President Jordan in Ransom Hall, I took a walk down Middle Path. I remember thinking to myself, this place looks and feels like the real thing. If it is what it seems, this could really be good. And by the real thing, I meant something like what I had experienced as an undergraduate, a full engagement with smart people who like to think and talk about big clashing ideas, where arguments were taken seriously but also lightheartedly, with excitement and fun, as well as devoted hard work. And I was skeptical, because since the 1950s, at least, that ideal of liberal education had been threatened by a grim specialist professionalism, and since the 1960s, by a fanatical utopian ideology. Well, the Kenyon I got to know in the 1980s turned out, somewhat to my surprise, to be as much of the real thing as the real world could be expected to produce. I was so-so at my administrative duties, but I loved teaching Quest, as I still do today. That course is, to me, the best single way into a liberal education that I know. And my department was full of highly intelligent and learned people who loved to argue with each other and with those in other disciplines. There were the veterans like Bob Fight, that was his nickname, Horwitz, poli-sci's refounder at Kenyon, the gentle but courageous Harry Clore, and the then newbies, now my old friends, Pam Jensen and Kirk Emmert, and in between, and also a good friend, that bellwether of sanity and moderation, John Elliott. But outside the department, there were those to admire, like Perry Lentz, and those to befriend, like Ellen Fenigstein, as well as those to fight with in the faculty meetings about serious questions like the feminization of the curriculum, colleagues I respected but will not now name. Kenyon was alive intellectually in a way I hadn't seen since I was an undergraduate. I felt relieved of the burden I'd had as a neoconservative apparatchik, namely of always having to be right. I could lose arguments, as I once did years later to the anthropologist Ed Shortman, and gain from it, and eventually, more on this later, gain a good friend. I arrived at a time of gradual but major transition. Kenyon had admitted women students in the 70s, and now women were entering the faculty. The administration, and especially the new provost, this was an opportunity to bring curriculum and indeed its whole being into the contemporary world. The form this took was a campaign, part serious, part silly, to feminize the curriculum, which to me meant to transform the college from a teaching to an indoctrinating school, from liberal to illiberal education. As an administrator and on the teaching side, a mere part-time visiting assistant professor, I had no real prospects of sticking around, so I cheerfully fought on what I thought was the good side, and others thought of as the male, chauvinist, reactionary, sexist, conservative, etc. side. Much fun was had by all in many a faculty meeting, and after some years, the matter was settled by the creation of the Women's Studies, later the Women and Gender Studies program, i.e., by a reasonable decision to live and let live. Things really got nasty mid-decade when the provost, who was said to have told friends that he was ashamed to be in an institution with a political science department like ours, made his move. And a battle royal took place that involved the whole faculty, the alumni, and it even made a couple of national magazines. Again, thinking that I had no future at Kenyon, I cheerfully took a major part in the fight. To my surprise, we won and survived as what we still are. To my even greater surprise, vastly greater surprise, President Jordan, to whom I had been in unrelieved pain since the fighting began, performed the most generous act of which I have ever been the recipient, and allowed me to apply to replace Bob Horwitz, who was in very bad health and had had to retire. And I got the job. At the same time that all that high-minded, principled, sometimes sanctimonious yelling was going on, I sensed an underlying kindness at Kenyon that I had never seen in any academic institution before. I kept meeting people, first-rate minds, teachers, and scholars, who had for some reason not made it elsewhere, but had found a true home here, on the faculty or in the administration and staff. I long thought of Kenyon as the place that redeemed and repaired people, where the stone that had been rejected could become the cornerstone. It had something to do with what a colleague who himself became one of the leading lights of the faculty and then one of the stalwarts of the administration, once in his somewhat sarcastic early years here called the Anglican Tea Party side of Kenyon. The good manners, even about conflict, that carried with it a real gentleness and consideration for actual individual human diversity. How many times have I heard a particularly prickly colleague, male or female, described with a tolerant shoulder shrug and the comment, well, X is just X. For me, what brought it home to me most pointedly happened early in my first year. The Jewish students had put up the sukkah, the gazebo that goes with the harvest festival, but they'd been too lazy to take it down. So out the window of what is now Horwitz House, but was then the PACC building, I saw the Episcopalian chaplain, the Reverend Lincoln Stelk, taking it down for them. I had a meeting at the development office to go to, and as I walked by, I realized I had a once in a lifetime chance for a pun, which of course I had to take. Ah, Reverend Stelk, I said, never give a sukkah an even break, eh? He looked at me in horror, probably thinking I was accusing him of anti Semitism. Joke, I said, and he looked relieved. The kindness of Kenyon was summed up in that for me, but I saw it everywhere. That kindness was reflected, maybe more accurately based, in the general spirit of the Gambier community. Social relations among faculty, among students, and between both groups had their share, as in any small world, of feuds and spitefulness. But to my mind, that all was heavily outweighed by a kind of gentle acceptance. It was best exemplified by the Friday luncheon cafes the two faculty spouses, Joy Klein and Peggy Durgin, prepared and ran for so many years. That was, and I have to say at the end, my wife helped run them too. That was, as my friends and I called it back in the day, the good lunch, to distinguish it from the dismal Lower Dempsey Thursday confab the then provost had set up for the faculty in those days. That was where students, faculty, staff, and even the occasional top administrator could sit down to quiche, salad, cake, and the famous café chocolat to talk things over or just schmooze informally, with spirits lifted and made gentler by the excellence of what we were eating. I learned early on when running the PACC conferences how much positive difference to the dynamics of the rest of the conference that first Joyce and Peggy lunch made. And the memories I have of some of those Friday lunch conversations, for example, the one where an elderly British professor of religion dropped the hint that we didn't know for sure, but we rather suspected that Peter might have been Jewish. One where a young visiting professor of biology complained about the department's vertocentrism, i.e., its unfortunate neglect of spineless organisms. And let those lunches be the emblem of what I saw and above all felt about how we were to each other year in and year out. Even, or maybe especially, faculty committees, which I had expected to be bear pits of petty conflict, turned out to be very different, if not quite the opposite. Places where party lines were crossed and people got to know each other and sometimes even made friends. The fact was, as the passages from Tocqueville that I teach the freshmen explain, that when people, even of very different ideological views have a common problem to solve, in this case, have to come up with something plausible to present to the whole faculty, have to deal with specifics and not just abstract loyalties, things change. Ice melts. Personalities are revealed and sometimes begin to mesh. But while I made friends inside and outside my department and was soon invited to the Friday late afternoon coffee clutches that were still possible before email and the internet ate up all our time with requests to fill out very important surveys about not so very evidently important things, while I began to feel at home at Kenyon, what really made me want to stay were the students, that is now you, the alums. From the beginning, teaching my one section of Quest down in the converted garage of what was then the PACC building and is now an emptied out Horwitz house with no knowable future, I knew I was where I wanted to be with the students I wanted to be with. Like just about every class of Kenyon students I've taught in the last 44, looks like 45 years, this year's bunch too, they were excited, serious about learning about big questions that mattered to them, and were delighted in the main to discover that the books we read talked about those questions in ways both surprising and profound, and sometimes very funny. You all were smart enough to see what was at stake, and smart enough to follow the trails and the clues that the authors dropped alongside them, at least if they were pointed out. Some of you, sure, went through things dutifully enough without breaking the surface much, but even then, sometimes years later, a student I had never realized had been doing much serious thinking would come back with a letter or later an email, in one case reporting that he was still thinking long after about the dispute between free will, about the dispute about free will between Erasmus and Martin Luther. Others are my constant delight, coming to office hours to argue, explore, dispute, borrow books, and sometimes become friends. And it wasn't just office hours. One of my intellectual friendships with an international student started in a conversation at the bookstore where he was working the checkout desk. Another, with a very serious Catholic student, started at a Kenyon Passover Seder, which he was visiting to see what Jews do. Our conversation, quickly and oddly, turned into a discussion of Goethe's Faust, and over the years went on from there to politics, theology, education, and life. As I think about the students who have been particularly memorable over the years, it occurs to me I should say something about a word that has become the dominant shibboleth of education and increasingly American life in the last couple of decades: diversity. That word, adopted as a mantra from Justice Powell's decision in the seminal affirmative action Bakke case, or excuse me, not his decision, his opinion in the seminal affirmative action Bakke case, where he cautiously claimed that racial diversity might be an acceptable reason for favoring minority students, though only in undergraduate admissions, has come to mean a clear and sharp division by legally defined groups with the ambitious goal of equity, meaning the attainment of substantive equality of result among groups. In this progressive, essentially top-down view, identity is fixed by origin and thus immutably separate from the identities of others, and unity is created by the justice of equal outcomes. The alternative liberal view, as beautifully outlined by Yuval Levin in his most recent book on the Constitution, American Covenant, accepts a flowing diversity of interests, coalitions, and alliances, where unity comes from agreement on the reciprocal arrangements that enable the Madisonian interplay of factions. But the diversity at Kenyon that I experienced was something different from either of these, something peculiarly appropriate to the world of liberal education. Thus, I think of a student from India whose education and upbringing had been so classically British, she is now a lawyer in Britain, while at the same time Indian, that both our common ground and our differences somehow made it easy to go farther and faster into thinking and talking about ideas, people, and possibilities that were neither hers or mine. I think of a Black student, an American, brilliant and touchy, who came to me as a freshman to complain about his grade. I had given him an A. He thought he didn't deserve it, but that I had given it to him because he was Black. One of my favorite pedagogic memories is going paragraph by paragraph to justify my praise of his work. I think of a kid from working class Ashtabula who at Kenyon has discovered a passion for Kant and Hegel. I think of an all-American swimmer who, through a study of such extreme thinkers as Nietzsche, became one of the most balanced and reasonable figures in American public life, to which he has contributed a great deal. And I think of a Chinese student, a brilliant physicist, a product of the Marxist, thus westernized China, but at heart and in soul, deeply Confucian in his attitudes to life. And of how distant as our backgrounds were on paper, we again found it easy to take the big arguments farther, faster than usual, and become friends. In those cases and the many others they stand for, acknowledgement and examination of differences turned out to be the basis for a new unity, the unity of those who love learning and doing it, as President Dean wisely put it, and as the Alumni Office has wisely put it here, in the company of friends. That was the unity and diversity, the a pluribus unum I have loved so much at Kenyon. In short, what they and the thousands I have lost contact with had in common, what made them in all their diversity Kenyon students, was the love of thinking and arguing, trying out the ideas they'd come across in and out of class, forming themselves out of what they had been into what they would become, treating their lives as something to be taken seriously, thought about, compared to others present and, very importantly, past, and not just drifted through minute by minute, year by year. They were getting a genuine liberal education. They knew it and they valued it, and I valued them for it, then and now. That explains, I think, Kenyon's sterling record over the years. A record I fear for every year, but that somehow stays unstained, unbroken, for how it treats visiting speakers, no matter how controversial. In my first years, William Bennett, then director of the National Endowment for the Humanities in the Reagan administration, was invited to speak. I knew him from my previous job where he'd been on the board of directors. He was worried because he'd just been to Holy Cross and been heckled. So he called me. What would Kenyon be like? I told him he needn't worry. This was Kenyon. We still did liberal education. He'd get a respectful audience and some hard questions afterwards. That's how it was for him and for every subsequent speaker. We've never had a speaker shouted down or even really shouted at. We don't do deplatforming here, nor do we think the perfect justice of our cause and the perfect injustice of the speakers, whoever they might be, justifies silencing or attacking them except with arguments. In this, if we don't stand alone, we stand a lot higher than places with fancier reputations. And we do it, I think, because we put learning above displays of moral indignation, curiosity above virtue signaling, the desire to know above the desire to win. Well, there's a Latin saying, tempora mutantur et nos in illis. Times change and we change in them. Kenyon changes. We're growing older, so have I. We all do. The same professors whom their elders thought unlikely to do much as scholars, 30 years later, we're looking at their juniors in the same dubious way. Professors are always finding the new crop of students to be somehow not up to the golden idols of the past. I know that I too am getting crankier and grumpier as I age, so what follows should be taken with even more grains of salt than you started with. Still, the complaints aren't always just nonsense. Yes, students today do have a harder time reading long texts than they used to. You don't need to learn the arts of intellectual triage so much when posting on X. And I've always wondered, when you finished posting on X, is that an ex post facto? And yes, probably our students are somewhat more psychologically fraught than in the past. And certainly the dumbing down of secondary education, which mirrors the perpetual and ongoing vulgarization of the culture, ads for law firms on TV, cartoon bears twerking in celebration of a brand of toilet paper, has had its effect on our students. When it comes to the inheritance of the past, art, ideas, music, facts, international students have always had it way over the Americans. But where the latter once came in with little, now they arrive with almost nothing, and much of that confused and wrong. Yet to me, despite some minor differences, the students I teach today are still very much the same as those I've taught since I got here. They're smart and above all, not just open, but eager to learn, to engage with hard thoughts and inferences, all the hungrier because their previous education has starved them so thoroughly, giving them answers instead of questions, transparent abstractions instead of opaque and contradictory tangles of conflicting possibilities. Just as eager, just as articulate, just as prepared to listen both to idealists and realists, just as full of promise as any of the past generations of Kenyon students I have known. That's the really good news about this place. In recent years, though, and here please recall my warning about trusting the gripes of the elderly, some things have changed that worry me. I won't kvetch here about the new buildings. I hate change as much as anyone and more than most. Yes, I miss the woods where the guns, so called to be distinguished, I guess, from all the other guns, now stands, but it's a nice building and we need it. And I'll probably even learn to tolerate the Sarah erection in the West Quad, but I won't tell you my private name for it. But with the new buildings came something else. Where the Office of Admissions was once John Cushion in a room in Ransom Hall, it is now a huge, sprawling brick edifice. Lots of people work there, doing good and important business for the college, work that, now that we are hitting the demographic cliff, is vital to the survival of the institution. But that expansion of, excuse the word, bureaucracy, something that has happened all over the higher education scene in this country, has changed the place, and not altogether for the better. Yes, I suppose it makes sense to have a program of pedagogic innovation. What with the new technologies, we have to keep up. And so for all the others. But overall, it necessarily has changed the character of the place. I'm well aware that in saying this, I am echoing those who were at Kenyon before me and looked with dismay at such benign innovations as coeducation and even the introduction of the PACC, which brought me to campus. It's an old song I'm singing, and I know it's a sour one. And yet, while we're still a long way from the world of Kafka's parable of the emperor's decree that never reaches the provinces because the messenger can never get out of the forbidden city, things have gotten somewhat less personal, somewhat more corporate, and therefore somewhat less communal, somewhat less kind, and somewhat more tending towards dealing with problems in general, top down ways, ways that may have the benefits of efficiency, but the drawbacks of not fitting individual cases all that well on occasion. The other and larger concern that I have is what has happened to student life as I observe it from the increasingly distant outside. Until about a decade ago, Kenyan students used eagerly to rip each other to shreds, verbally, on Allstu, at Pierce, and in the dorms, about all kinds of controversial topics, political, moral, cultural, you name it. These scraps featured vulgar language, opprobrium, contempt, incivility, and above all, a cheerful invulnerability to all of it. The dean of students once anxiously urged the students to be more measured and civil. She missed, I thought, the true spirit of it, which was no harm, no foul. I recall a particularly refined and brilliant European student who had entered a faculty debate on some point in her typically rational and cultivated way. And then I saw that she had dutifully made the same arguments on Allstu, only in very vulgar language. In both cases, she was speaking in the appropriate language of her American, all too American audiences. As the larger culture changed and Kenyon changed with it, we heard more and more from above about the need for sensitivity, the evils of microaggressions, of culture appropriation, and of much else. Yik Yak arrived and was used for anonymous and highly personal attacks on those who had strayed from the orthodoxy. We've seen dramatic evidence of the paradoxical results of that new orthodoxy across the country in this past year. Somehow, though I think predictably, the transformation of the mission of higher education to the overcoming of group inequities and hatreds seems to have had the effect of reviving and intensifying old hatreds and perhaps inventing some new ones. Fortunately, at present at least, Kenyon has not suffered anywhere near as much as the famous elite universities that have been seen disgracing themselves publicly in Congress and on campus in recent months. The fundamental decency of this place still persists. But the culture of identity politics has had its effect on discourse at Kenyon, and that effect, especially on students, has been stultifying. Students keep silent in class and out about anything that might get them in trouble. Here's an example from class 2 years ago. I was teaching Ibsen's play, The Enemy of the People. In Act 4, the hero, Dr. Stockman, goes on a rant about how terrible democracy is, a rant that goes into eugenic comparisons of people to well-bred dogs and mongrels. I asked the class who Dr. Stockman sounded like then. I thought the answer would be obvious. Dead silence, though. Finally, disappointed, I said, "He sounds like a Nazi, doesn't he?" An otherwise very talkative student raised his hand and said, "I was going to say that, but I thought it might be offensive." I wondered who he thought he might possibly offend. Were there Nazis in the room? But I realized later that that was the wrong question. Like his fellow students had and have, he had become like prey animals, equipped with a delicate smell for the sense for the smell of danger. Anything controversial that keeps up, you keep a safe distance. Of course, where controversy has been sufficiently settled one way or the other, you can or even encouraged to join in, to speak up, and even to march and chant slogans, as several hundred did last May, while those who were being threatened implicitly and maybe even explicitly kept the prudent silence. For what it's worth, I saw today the Fire, which is a free speech organization that focuses on universities. They came out with their national rankings. The best, number one, was University of Virginia. The worst, number 251, was, of course, Harvard, followed closely by Columbia. Kenyon ranked 90th, which is not that great. And it had on their website, they have some somewhat disturbing quotes from students. In passing, it's my guess that much of the ugliness of the campus behavior at elite institutions, the demonization of hated enemies, the reduction of everything to slogans and abstractions, the sheer rage of it, has not a little to do with the emptiness in the student ragers, a vacuum that they feel, fear, and conceal with a great show of certainty and indignation. That emptiness is what liberal education is supposed to replace with knowledge and with the virtues that go with seeking it, namely respect for the difficulty of answering serious questions, respect for those who answer them differently, and the concomitant moderation of one's own certainties. That Kenyon isn't, at least yet, a scene for extreme hatreds suggests we're still doing our main business right. That those other places are suggests that they aren't. Going back to my own undergraduate experience, I know that this fear of saying what one thinks, which is the mirror image, I believe, of the fear about themselves that the fanatics conceal with angry noise, to be a terrible danger to liberal education. Back then, I arguably learned as much from my fellow students as from my professors. I got a pretty good version of a class on Marxist thought from discussing things like the labor theory of value, the gehackte labor theory, as we called it, a pun I won't explain, with my friends who were taking it, though I wasn't. I'd say that at least half of a good liberal education happens outside of class, among fellow students, where the ideas and texts are digested, ruminated on, processed, internalized, given their place in one's own structure of thinking, imagining, and feeling. When the cone of silence and suspicion comes down, true education suffocates or breathes at most out of one lung. And to some extent, that has in fact happened at Kenyon. A very good sign, however, is that the current administration both seems to be well aware that student dialogue needs to be encouraged and revived, and is trying as hard as it can to do it. I wish President Kornfeld and Vice President Lemus well in their efforts. It matters more than anything else, at least so it seems to me, because all the rest of it at a liberal arts college is ultimately what happens in the souls of students. That it is not the be all and end all of a research university, far from it. The example of former President Summers at Harvard University demonstrates. He urged the faculty to care about teaching undergraduates and was told not to be silly. Harvard professors are there to do glorious research, not to demean themselves by teaching undergraduates. And he resigned not long after. But undergraduates are everything to Kenyon. Over the years, I was an active participant in the doings of the college. There were the succession of small crises that, when you look back, add up to a time of relative serenity, and then the occasional biggies, like the one that arose out of President Nugent's plan to outsource our maintenance staff to a multinational corporation. That was one where, perhaps even to our own surprise, the faculty, students, and staff, perceiving a real threat to our communal identity, rallied, made trouble, and to President Nugent's credit, eventually won through. Kenyon found itself again, at least for a time. I recall making a passionate speech to a special meeting at which I defended Kenyon as a feudal institution where we take care of our own. And I received strong support from my leftist progressive colleagues, a moment to be cherished, and one out of which a friendship with a colleague I had stayed away from for ideological reasons for 30 years, Ed Shortman, finally came to be. But over the years, as the reigning ideology diverged more and more from my own views, I began to withdraw. Partly it was that, partly it was age. When most of your contemporaries, friends, and acquaintances are retired, out of town, or dead, you lose touch and feel more like what you are, a fossil, or as one of my retired friends calls me, a dinosaur. In 2018, I stopped attending faculty meetings after the body passed by a margin of 9-1 a motion I found so wrong-headed and at the same time so emblematic of what the faculty now believed that I concluded it was useless to try to influence my colleagues about anything important anymore. Since then, I've only opened my trap on a couple of occasions, embarrassing myself in the opinion of many who, in my opinion, while perhaps not embarrassing themselves, were themselves embarrassed by me. Therefore, I have a strong sense that any view I have of the future of Kenyon is pretty unreliable. Those triceratopses probably weren't too optimistic about the future the mammals they saw scurrying around them were about to create. Still, what gives me hope every day are the students I teach and meet and argue with, as does the current leadership of the college, which seems to understand what we're supposed to be about and is trying to keep us on track. Above all, it is the character of Kenyon students I trust in. They are always, with exceptions, of course, so good humored, so grateful for what they are learning, so excited about it, and so supportive of each other. You just don't hear about students competing in vicious ways, withholding information from rivals or the like. For all their issues, personal, psychological, ideological, the collective impression I've always gotten is of a kind of joy that is at once serious and playful and full of goodwill. Like you, they will become, for the most part, members of the ruling class of this country and of others. And little as I trust our or any ruling class to see the public interest clearly through the blinders of its own, I've always had the sense that the Kenyon component of that class would be saner, more decent, more realistic, but less cynical than the graduates of the places I studied at. They would be as capable as any, but with real hearts, not just the puffed up velveteen fake ones that look good on the internet. As one of our very best students, a brilliant woman who got her law degree from a top institution, then decided on a career in Yellowstone as a park ranger who handles legal issues on the side, said to me when she came back from a high powered summer program in Washington when she was, I think, a junior. I met all these kids from Yale and Harvard, and they'd read way more books than I had. But I had learned how to think, so I understood things they'd never thought about. And as a former colleague and Kenyon alum, now probably himself approaching retirement at another fine liberal arts college, as he said years earlier, when he was asked if Kenyon's failure to teach him social science methodology, we do it now, but then we didn't, had put him behind in graduate school, said, yes, put me 6 months behind. But my colleagues had missed out on things I got at Kenyon they'll never catch up with. They both speak from my long held view of what Kenyon students are like across the board. Our science students learn the latest theories and techniques, but they're also taught to think about the status of scientific knowledge and its relation to the knowledge of the whole. Our painters, photographers, and sculptors, our actors and directors, musicians and dancers are never mere technicians, but students of the history of their crafts and the ideas and arguments that drove them and that also connected them to the larger world of thought and culture. Our economists are also never mere technicians, but are invited to think about the human beings who are caught up in economic systems and who reciprocally make them what they are. And from what I know of those who stay in touch, they become the kind of people I respect and admire, the ones who have some depth and resonance, not just a repertoire of costumes, poses, and gestures. I think you know what I mean. I won't push it. When it comes to the future of Kenyon, there is much to worry about, I gather. Demographics, finances, the surrounding political culture, by which I don't mean Mount Vernon political culture with its Trump at last the president with balls yard signs, the decline of the humanities in a world of anxiety about the economic future, and much more. But Kenyon is surely in a far better position now than it was, say, when President Caples was brought in to save it. And as long as what I told William Bennett those many years ago remains true, as it does still today, and we do real liberal education here, I am confident that we won't have to wish old Kenyon farewell anytime soon. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you, not for you, excuse me, and for listening patiently. I will be happy to respond to any questions, remarks, or polemics as well as I can. Thank you. What happens now, I don't know.
I think now's a good time if people have any questions or anything they'd like to ask, you're more than welcome to.
Uh, Fred Baumann, this is Melissa Early. I
Hi,
graduated from.
Melissa.
How are you? It's good to see you.
See you.
I I was thinking about I serve now a very small church in Leadville, Colorado that has a very robust meal and ministry and food pantry. And we say we build community by sharing food. And so as you were speaking about the beauty of the Friday Lunch Cafe, which I remember, the cheese bread was particularly amazing. Um, and then the kind of community that can be developed on a small campus like Kenyon that's isolated and remote. It seems to me that those kinds of relationships are what make it possible for true dialogue where we dare to try out the idea that's risky, where we dare to confront one another with questions that we might not even know how to ask in a way that's appropriate, and where someone can both take offense and then explain and educate and just where we can grapple with what it means to be community in deeper ways. It does take some of those communal habits of eating together, of playing together, of living together. So I mean, maybe there's a place there there's still hope for Kenyon because of its size and its location and communal spirit.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. And uh, what always struck me at Kenyon was how a few people made an enormous difference. Joyce and Peggy were two of them. Jack Finnefrock with a bookstore that went through some bad phases in the early part years of the century, but has been restored, but not quite to what it was. Um, they make a difference. They can make an enormous difference. The people who are out there and helping and bringing people together. And very often it's not top down, it's not from the administration, it comes from people in the community. And I've seen that at work. I see it at work all the time now for various reasons that close to someone who does that kind of thing. And that is what we need. And it's, of course, reciprocal. People who are isolated, who are on their cell phones, when you walk along Middle Path, used to be nobody had cell phones. Now, if you want to say hello to somebody and talk to somebody, you always have to take their earbuds out first. I mean, people are so isolated, it's hard to bring them together. But when you bring them together, maybe they become less isolated. And we need that. I think you're absolutely right. And what I said about the conferences where all kinds of big names would come and their various fields, and they would kind of be very suspicious of each other at first. One Joyce and Peggy lunch, and the afternoon session was completely different. Yeah, 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 right. Well, and the conference took off. So yes, you're absolutely right. I agree with you. We need more of that.
I'm curious if there are any readings you've assigned consistently over the years that you either read very differently or teach very differently now than you used to, as times have changed or students have changed.
Ah, that's interesting. Well, yes. I used to, in Quest for Justice, we teach on liberty, John Stuart Mill's famous essay in defense of freedom of speech, all that, freedom of action. That teaching that used to be really boring because everybody agreed going in. Of course, everything should be free. In recent years, I it's much more controversial. Yeah, Freedom of speech? Really? What about disinformation? What about misinformation? And I have to fight for Mill in a way that I never had to. It makes teaching him much more interesting. And then, maybe this isn't quite what you asked, we read Aristotle's Politics in Quest for Justice. We always read book 1 and book 3, maybe a little of book 6. About 12 years ago, I always ask my students in Quest to send me questions about the reading, and I can reply to them, and I know where they are, and I don't have to give quizzes. And there are about 3 or 4 very good students who sent me these questions before we discussed Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. One question was, how come religious people have the right to talk about religion in public? Don't we have separation of church and state? And the second question was, how come the Ku Klux Klan have rights of speech and assembly? Aren't they bad? And the third and most interesting question was, the purpose of government, says the Federalist, is justice. But with all these checks and balances, how can you ever get justice? And I realized when I read those 3 questions that something very big had changed. That I had always thought there's a difference between Americans and Europeans. It goes down the line. Americans, I mean continental Europeans, not the British. Americans always have this gut knowledge, right or wrong. What goes around comes around. The law is the same for everybody. Everything should be the same for everybody. Whereas the Germans or the French people I had met, that is so naive, yeah? Of course, there are class differences, and blah, 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 and we play the liberal political game, but it's only a game. We're actually doing what we can to have our class win. I thought that was a clear difference between Americans and Europeans, continental Europeans. And then I learned from them that that wasn't true anymore, that they were thinking the way the Europeans did. There are good people and bad people, and the good people have to make the bad people obey. Yeah? So that's that. No, nothing's procedural, everything's substantive. And so from then on, I always started to teach book 2, not just the beginning, the first 2 chapters of book 2 of Aristotle, where he explains very vaguely that reciprocity is necessary. There is such a thing as reciprocal justice. The rules have got to be the same for everybody in some way, to some extent. And I've taught that now for the last dozen years or so, because I think things have changed, and boy, that has to be taught now. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, haven't used Zoom in a long time.
I believe you have a question. Someone asked, can you tell more about the resolution or vote you mentioned that you strongly objected to?
Yes, I can, but only in the question period, not in the lecture. It was a motion to create a new criterion to judge teaching in tenure and full professor promotion reviews. And that new criterion was diversity. You had to be good on diversity. And to me, that was a political test for membership in the faculty, because diversity is a subject of political debate. I mean, of course, it's very vague what it means. I think what it means always in the end, and it was used that way, not being colorblind, but benefiting some groups in a compensatory way for what they have suffered historically. And that's something I've been arguing about for 50 years. And I don't like particularly, I take the colorblind argument seriously. I support it. But what really bothered me about it was that it was a political loyalty oath. And when it passed 9-1, I thought, okay, these are not, I'm not going to be one of those old coots who gets up there and says, rah, 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 back in 1375 when I was a lad. I didn't want to be that. And so I bowed out.
Professor, you mentioned that you've noticed that students' reading capability has decreased only slightly, but their intellectual capacity remains the same, but also that they're less forthcoming with their own opinions in class. I'm curious how you square those two things and how you think the situation can be improved.
I thought it was three things.
Yes, three things.
So I don't have to, I can triangulate them. um, People, I said, not that they don't read well, but they don't read long well. It's all internet stuff. And it's not that that can't be taught, it can be taught, but it's harder for them to. I remember when I was in high school, they had a rule for the New York State Regents exams, for the history exams. 3 points for an idea, 2 points for a supporting fact. Okay, that's a kind of triage. And when you read a novel or a learned paper or something like that, you have to figure out what's really important, what's secondary and supportive, and what's kind of just you can let that go. And they haven't got much practice in that. They learn it. They can learn it. As what was it that they don't say what they mean? Yeah, well, a lot of stuff that we debate isn't that controversial. It doesn't have Nazi in it or something like that. And so you can tell that they're very smart. And the third thing, uh, they're hungry. They're hungrier than earlier generations of students, I find. And that's good. And I think they're hungrier because they've never been given anything with real fiber in it. It's all passes through the digestion. It's a set of answers, it's a set of abstract thoughts. Which side are you on, good, bad? They're not forced to argue about things. And when people, you remember, not that long ago, are 18 years old, they're ready really to take things on. And they're up, you don't need to give them baby food anymore. They've got strong teeth. And there's a kind of joy that I sense now in finally being given something where the answers aren't obvious, where you really have to work. So though that's I think how those things work together.
Sorry, can you clarify when you say that they're hungry? Are they hungry to prove their own bias or opinions already, or are they?
That's the beauty of it. I don't find much of that. Now, it may be also a kind of triage. The students I get are not usually violent ideologues of any kind. My guess is they wouldn't take my classes. So they may be out there and I don't know about them. And I run across a couple of them here and there. But the students that I see are, as I said, they're open. They want to know and they don't simply want to impose their beliefs on everybody else. That's why they're a delight.
I guess the reason I'm asking is because I'm a little confused. If they're afraid to say opinions that may not be popular, how do they learn the other side of the coin?
Well, they're willing to let me say those things.
Okay.
They're willing to think about them, and maybe behind closed doors with somebody they trust, they'll talk about them. But what they're afraid of is stating anything publicly, and class is public to some degree, because otherwise they're going to get yik-yacked or people won't invite them to lunch. You recall how important popularity is when you're 18, 19, 20. And to be shunned because you have the wrong beliefs, they're terrified of that, and I understand that. And that does happen. If you're interested, go on the FIRE website and look up Kenyon and look at some of those comments, and they're just about that. Yeah. 44, according to the FIRE, 44% of Kenyon students admit, of the ones they polled, admit to self-censoring. I'm surprised the number's that low. But in a way, class like ours, it's a place where it's relatively safe and you can try things out. But that kid wasn't willing even to say that, and nobody else in the class was willing to say it. So, if we're talking about ancient Greece, we're okay. We're talking about human character, psychology, we're okay. But hot button issue, uh-uh. that work? No. Why not?
I'm just worried about if we can't interact at a place like Kenyon and have honest debates about things that are going on in the world, it is hard for me to imagine where it would work.
Yeah.
And there have been several incidences where you've been involved, like, but I've only known from afar, like the play and in some weird way, the freshmen sing, that just makes me kind of worried about it.
Well, I'm worried about it too, as I think I said. And the good thing is that both President Kornfeld and Vice President for Student Life, Lemus, get it. They see it and they're trying. I'm not sure it's going to work. I mean, when the moon loses its atmosphere, it's very hard to get it back. I don't think the Kenyon of the 1980s or 90s is coming back, but at least they're trying. They're trying to get people to open up. One of the really good things that they keep coming up time and again, some student group organizes evenings for discussion of difficult topics. And we had that last year and it seemed to start working. I hope it continues. That helps. Uh, there is a magazine, you may know, The Observer, that has gone in and out of existence from time to time. And for a run there in before COVID, the last decade, it was a very good, nonpartisan, bipartisan, all kinds of very smart articles about politics from Kenyan students. I remember reading an article on Ireland, Irish politics, and then reading another one from The Economist that same week. And I thought the one in The Observer was better. That's being refounded by a couple of sophomores this year. And I know them because I taught them last year in their first grade. So there are some hopeful signs, but I'm worried too.
Well, it looks like we're right at 7:59 right now. I just wanna, we can kind of continue this if people want, but I will stop recording. If you guys enjoyed this event, which I hope you all did, I encourage you to register for some of our other upcoming lecture series. Tuesday, October 5th, we have Judy Holdner from the mathematics department talking about the history of the mathematics department. And then our last virtual lecture series, a part of this 200 years in learning in the company of friends, ends with Jay Corrigan as he discusses why it's so hard to find a good used car. I'll drop the link in the chat for the upcoming lecture series to register for, but other than that, I want to thank you all for coming tonight and we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. I'll stop recording.